Hello, everybody. Welcome to Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States. And today we have a very hot topic we're going to be discussing, and that deals with the Chinese trade war that's going on. Apparently, these tariffs have escalated where they're over 145% on Chinese goods being imported in the United States. How is this going to affect the economy? How is it going to affect the United States of America in their worldwide negotiations? So with that, we're bringing in the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, to give us what's going on here between, hey, David, what's going on here between China and the United States? Do we have a big trade war looming? And is this going to hurt the American economy and the American consumer?
Well, it's a very serious issue. There are, as you know, the new administration, the Trump administration, has a philosophy in regard to trade. They believe that the United States has been taken advantage of for many, many years. The United States faces large trade deficits with many countries. In some cases, it's because of tariffs. In some cases, it's because of non-tariff trade barriers. In some cases, it's because those other countries, frankly, produce better products and or have certain materials that we need that we don't have here in the United States. Trump announced a policy that he wanted to have reciprocity with regard to tariffs. Now, reciprocity to most people would mean that if you're going to charge a 10% tariff on cars, then I'll charge a 10% tariff on cars. However, that's not how his reciprocity calculation was done. It evidently was based upon the trade deficit with the respective country, which is in the case of China, is very large. In 2004, the U.S. had an almost $300 billion trade deficit with China in total. It had a trade surplus in connection with services, but a trade deficit in connection with products and materials and other types of things. And when you do the calculations the way that he did it, that ended up coming up with over 100%, 145%. Tariff, if you will, which includes the 20% amount associated with fentanyl, a penalty for fentanyl, because they are the source of the materials necessary to create fentanyl, although the fentanyl is typically produced in Mexico or someplace else. We have a pause on most of the proposed tariffs for 90 days so that negotiations can take place. That pause does not apply to China. And hopefully this thing will get worked out over time. I think people that don't understand China, don't really realize that saving face is of critical importance to them. And so, somehow if this thing is going to be resolved, it's going to have to be resolved in a way that it looks like that both the United States and China ended up gaining something out of it, if you will, because there's no way that they're going to agree to something if it looks like that they were, humiliated in any way. They have too much pride for that. Let me tell you my real concern. The world has changed dramatically since the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, the United States was over 50% of global GDP, or just over 50%. It was the leading manufacturer by far in the world. It was the only major nation that didn't suffer, attacks on its homeland. And the dollar was as good as gold. That's not the situation today. The situation today is the United States is a little over 25% of global GDP in nominal dollars, but China is ahead of the United States when you count it on purchasing power parity. China is now the dominant manufacturing, country in the world by far. But the thing that bothers me even more is that when you talk about things like rare earth materials and when you talk about semiconductors, with regard to rare earth, China controls approximately 69% of global rare earth mineral production and about 90% of the world's rare earth processing capacity. And those rare earth materials are critical not just for, products and services that we all like, including, mobile phones and other types of technology, but also for weapon systems. And in addition, Taiwan, which China recognizes as part of China, and no country, including the United States, of any consequence, recognizes them as a separate country, controls over 90% of high-end and advanced semiconductor chips production in the world. So those are the things that I get concerned about, is if we can't resolve this in some amicable fashion, then what happens with regard to our ability to access these critical materials? We're trying to take steps to onshore a lot of this capacity and to be able to look for alternative sources with our allies, but that doesn't happen overnight. And I'm not sure that this has been given adequate enough consideration by the current administration. So those are just a few of my thoughts off the top of my head. There are certain things that we're not going to compete with. We can't compete with China on. And when you talk about textiles, with their cost of labor, we can't effectively compete. Although some Americans will end up wanting to buy American, as out of patriotism, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be the low cost provider. We in the United States have to compete on innovation, productivity, quality, and reliability, because we can't compete with most countries on wages, especially when you're talking about labor-intensive manufacturing activities. So back to you, Nick.
Yeah, this is what they say, not good, but there was a special on BBC earlier today about Armenia and how they were educating their 9-year-olds on how to code and program. So if you go to a school in Armenia, you're actually learning how to do pretty advanced programming starting at 9 years old. And they're very serious about being leaders in technology, where the United States, I'm not sure if our educational system is even close to up to par, nor they know what's going on. But this is big because China's a big economy. So now we're going to bring in our big panel from around the world. We have Kim Calhoun coming in from the United States. We also have Sharif, who lives over in the Asia area, and he's in China and India. So that's kind of two good, wonderful people to deal with. And then Shaquille from Australia, and they recently had their own tiff, it sounds like, with China down under, and Jatovi from the United States. And of course, we know the U.S. has different positions. Well, I'll start with Dr. Sharif. The United States and their trade war with China. What are you hearing out of Asia about that? They just sent back a bunch of Boeing planes, which cost millions of dollars. But what do you hear about that over in Asia?
Yeah, basically this trade war right now heavily discussed in Asia Pacific. Many trade conference, all of the national and local news and media and all of the things. Even though in geopolitically, if you see that Bangladesh or South Asia, we have strong engagement both in USA, let's say Bangladesh heavily manufacturing garments products. We have strong relations with USA. On the other hand, Bangladesh want to be next manufacturing hub. That's why we also have engagement with Belt and Road Initiative. So when we see we are small, we have around 171 million people. We are small compared to other giants, but we are the place where we can play with South Asia. We can work with South Asia. But things is that how I see as an economist this trade war and all of the things, USA how they play from the Biden administration. It's not from only the Trump, from Biden administration. They are exposing lot of barrier and expansions on China. Even though already Mr. David Walker discussed about this semiconductor industries, but beside that, they are producing tariff and barrier, especially USA for China, for electric vehicles, solar panel, batteries, semiconductor, electronics, steel and aluminum, and all of the things. But you have to understand, this is not 1940s before the World War I or World War II. This is 2025. Even though when USA actually doing all of the immigration law implementations, tariff implementations, all of the things, you have to understand China, India, Asia Pacific has very large market, billions of people in between our communities. So it will be very harmful for USA if they deploy this kind of tariff. All of the, not only China, they even deploy tariff for Bangladesh, right? 37%. They deploy everywhere. So this is not the World War One or World War Two. You cannot go with a global diplomacy, global business, or global relation in that way, like 1940s. You have to understand the people mindset. Now we are very open-minded. Now we have, because of social media, internet, all of the things, we can understand each other very well. And China really doing well in terms of Belt and Road Initiative. And most interesting thing, what is the harmful even for USA? What I discussed in the last TV show. Look, if Asia Pacific they want to build up very high quality AI, compete with USA, they can. They want to build up electric vehicle industries, they can. Manufacturing hub, they can. But what Asia Pacific overnight cannot do, let's say next 10 years, 20 years, I want to ask you. But according to my understanding, let's say the Ivy League university, like Harvard University, like MIT, like Stanford, what is the powerhouse and research and innovation hub for USA? They cannot produce. And this is very harmful when we observe from as an external. Even Trump exposing or implementing different law for Harvard University. This is very harmful. It's not 1940s. You cannot close the society. So I believe that the world has major problem for leadership. That's why my institution, with US universities, with Japanese university, we are taking the initiative of leadership development. We need to focus on developing good leaders and global leaders. If US can understand, they can lead. If they can not understand, maybe other countries will lead the global leadership positions. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Shaquille from Down Under. We want to hear what's happening. We did notice that there's a little rift between Australia and China right now, which I thought you guys were great trading partners. But what's going on down under, Nate?
Well, this is a continuation, I think, of a previous spat, shall we say, where the Australian government had said some not so pleasant things about China, and China responded by tariffing our goods and not buying as much of our wine and our meat products and our milk and things like that. But as I said, at the moment, there has actually been an increase in demand on Australian produce by China, because I think they're trying to look for alternatives to buying these things from the United States. Now, how will this play out? I don't know. It's a somewhat dangerous game, because to basically put a 90-day freeze on tariffs for everybody except for China, you don't want to have the two biggest economies in the world fighting like that. That I don't think is pleasant. As Sharif mentioned, they've got the Belt and Road Initiative. China has tried to expand its trade routes around the world, and I do think it can be fraught with danger to do it this way, because the Chinese are not necessarily going to be receptive. And as I'm not sure who, whether it's Sharif or David said, China's not going to want to look like they're losing face. So I think Americans need to remember that the way that Americans do business, if that's what Donald Trump thinks this is, just a standard business deal, the way that Americans do business is not necessarily how business is done in other countries. And, a lot of Asian countries, they won't give you a straight yes or no answer. And especially if the answer is no, they won't come out and tell you no directly. They normally try to say it in a more sort of fluffy, flowery way. So, there could be some cultural differences there. And I'm not sure that Trump's necessarily going to prevail with this argument with China. Somebody's going to have to give at some point. The other thing is that Donald Trump has kind of put himself into a hole. He's backed himself into a corner, because his great spiel to the United States essentially was that the reason why the middle class is suffering and the reason why all these people are out of work is because those jobs have been displaced and moved over to other countries like China. Well, okay, now you've put yourself into that position, and now you're going to go into a trade war with China. And China recently responded with what I thought was a rather amusing AI meme video showing Americans working in textile factories. Clearly that's not. I believe that's not what Donald Trump's trying to achieve, is to bring back textile jobs to the United States. But it's problematic, and I think there needs to be some great strategy there. Having said that, Donald Trump's only just sort of been in office now for a few months. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Donald Trump often had some sort of longer term plans, so I'm not going to write him off just yet. It'll be just interesting to see how that plays out.
We're also going to say that recently, I believe J.D. Vance made a comment about China and I believe David Walker said China is a very proud country and they don't like things that make them lose face. The comment relating to this was that Americans buy and borrow from, quote, Chinese peasants. So I'm going to ask him this question. How do you defend the statement to a proud nation like China that we buy and borrow from Chinese peasants? How do you defend that, Counselor?
Well, I think one of my biggest things would be is to ask myself here in the United States, how much debt do we actually owe to China? They are the second largest debt holder of our foreign debt, as second only to Japan, which I found odd in my research. I didn't realize we owed so much money to Japan. Now, my question is to David, how does this hurt us when we start a trade war with someone who owns our mortgages, and they don't own them directly, but you know what I'm talking about, through treasury bonds and things like that. How does this hurt us right now with China and potentially Japan, because we're dishonoring and disrespecting our original agreements with rash, reckless, knee-jerking actions? So what can we do, one, to fix the problem? Because right now, no one's going to be able to afford anything. My water filter I have to buy annually, cost me $19 last year. This year it cost me $60. So the tariffs didn't help. So, but how is this going to hurt us, like the big economic picture, when we owe them so much money already?
Well, first, Japan is the largest foreign holder of U.S. Treasury securities, over $1 trillion. China is second. Last time I looked, over $800 billion. Both of them are reducing their appetite for purchasing Treasury securities. Now, what does that do? Well, we all know about the old concept of supply and demand with regard to economics. On one hand, you have historical purchasers of our securities that have less of an appetite to buy more. On the other hand, we're running deficits of about $2 trillion a year and therefore have a need to be able to borrow more rather than less. That means it will put upward pressure on interest rates. That combined with the fact that, our current budget proposal that's being considered by the Congress makes things worse, not better, as compared to current law, is not obviously providing a great deal of confidence with regard to our ability to put our finances in order, which is therefore resulting, among other things, in a reduction in the value of the dollar. The dollar has lost value in the last several months. I think it's important that we resolve these trade differences expeditiously. But let me just give you a few percentages that people may not be aware of. Okay.
Thank you.
China has 50% of the global share of chemicals, 67% of the global share of electronic vehicles, 75% of the global share of batteries, 80% of the global share of drones, 90% of the global share of solar panels, 2 times U.S. manufacturing capacity. It'll be 4 times by 2030, 2 times U.S. power production, 3 times U.S. car production, 13 times U.S. steel output, 20 times U.S. Cement production and 200 times U.S. shipbuilding capacity. You know, these are facts. Now, all the more reason why the United States needs allies more than ever, because the only way that we compete in a number of these areas is through our alliances. Because when you end up combining the total capabilities of the United States and our historical alliances, you know, we exceed, China's capability. But standing alone, we don't. That's just a fact.
But I'm curious, what could China do? What is the consequences that could happen that will just crush the United States at this point?
Well, they're not going to crush us, but they can hurt us. First, they can decide not to buy any more Treasury securities. They can try to sell their Treasury securities to others. That obviously will end up accelerating and exacerbating an increase in interest rates. They can cut us off from access to certain rare earth materials. They could end up taking a step to try to take control of Taiwan, either through a blockade or otherwise. And it's important to understand that these don't just hurt the United States. They hurt many countries around the world. I mean, because, when you've got the percentage of global capacity that they have, we're not the only country relying upon rare earth materials. We're not the only country relying upon high-end semiconductor chips. Those are very big leverage points. There's no question about it.
Well, when you talk about those minerals and things like that, there are other things too that they supply us. And I just caught wind of happening is they've decided to cut off shipping our medical supplies to us. We get a huge amount of medical supplies and pharma from China. And that is going to impact the way our medical industry can take care of our people in our country. What are your thoughts on that, David?
Well, there's absolutely no question that China also is the source of a lot of materials that are necessary for many of our prescription drugs. And so, it's an economic issue, it's a national security issue, and it's a public health issue. And each one of those are a matter of concern, collectively a major concern.
Hey, David, speaking about those issues and all along those lines and in that space, I was just wondering, because I had another thought, and it somewhat deals with China, but not exclusively China, but it definitely deals with the Middle East and everything like that. But how concerned, because I remember one of Trump's campaigns was drill, baby, drill, and everything like that. And I just read, that's one of the issues I was going to get to on the news before us and everything that I didn't get to. But one of the indigenous leaders of the Amazon, Brazil, basically said that not on my watch and everything, basically that we shouldn't drill down there. So how much of the access to oil and natural resources do we have, and how much will that play into the economic picture? And should we be trying to go down to the Amazon to drill? Because Rayoni, who I believe is one of the indigenous leaders, was like I said, he was saying, not on my watch. He does not want that on his watch. And I know there's this whole notion of even us drilling in the national parks, which Kemp has brought up a couple of times as well. So what are your thoughts about this notion of that oil and natural resources being something that we have in our purview as well as the purview of some of our allies?
Well, clearly one of the advantages that we have over China is that we can be self-sufficient with regard to energy, and China is clearly not. We can be an exporter of fossil fuels. And when China talks about drill, baby, drill, what he's talking about is, reducing regulatory burdens and increasing the ability to be able to drill in the United States. He says that he's a believer in all of the above energy strategy, meaning fossil fuels, including oil, including natural gas, including coal. But he's also a believer in alternative forms of energy, such as solar, wind, water. But those are going to take years to be able to bring online. They don't have the same degree of reliability, that fossil fuels do. China is heavily dependent upon oil imports, in particular from Iran. But in addition to that, China is heavily dependent on coal, and they are rapidly building coal plants, which obviously is not helpful with regard to the environment, depending upon what type of coal they're using. But China is also ahead with regard to fourth generation nuclear energy. And that's something that, quite frankly, the United States needs to be more assertive on, because, lots of progress have been made with regard to the safety of using nuclear to generate electricity as compared to the 3 Mile Island incident years ago that people think about. And in addition, it's a very clean source of energy. And so that's something that, they're ahead of us on. They're also ahead of us in other areas that are of concern, like hypersonic weapons. They're ahead of us on that. And, and so, look, I don't think a conflict with China is inevitable. They are clearly a competitor. And I don't think it's in the world's interest for us to have a major trade war with China. And I'm hoping that we can end up working something out over the next several months.
David, just as a follow-up really quick, and I did see Toby's hand as well, but how concerned should we be about safety? Because whenever I think about coal mining, and I do know people in West Virginia and other places, that's always been the issue, is the safety of the coal mining. And I don't know that it ever has become a safer way to do coal mining. But I just wanted, should that be a concern even if we go in that space?
What's a lot safer than it used to be. One of my grandfathers was a steel worker. The other one was a mine worker. And it's much safer than it used to be. A lot of mining nowadays, happens to be not the deep underground mining, but strip mining.
Right.
That tends to be how a lot of things are done in fracking, with regard to accessing, things like natural gas, if you will, and other fossil fuels.
Yeah, just Toby.
In terms of the coal mining, I saw that he's looking at health cuts around black lung protections and stuff like that, which is also going to be a issue. But my big question for you, Dave, because with stocks in free fall, we have the dollar going down. We have kind of this outrage that's bubbling up in the U.S. Also, Trump going after the Fed chair now. It feels to me as if he's in more of a desperate situation where he's doing a lot of stuff out of desperation to get a win. Because I think during the campaign or during one interview where he talked about where he did not want to be that president that had the had the Depression or something. I'm trying to remember his exact words on that interview, but he talked about how stocks falling and depression coming into play, and he never wanted to be that kind of president. So with the talks of recession, the stocks falling, the dollar amount, and everything else, and him, like I said, I feel he's acting a lot out of desperation, especially with this China war, the trade war with China. What protections in the markets or in our own economy can you explain to us that are there that can actually protect us from any type of desperate moves that he may begin to do? Because, like I said, right now in less than 100 days, we have a lot of losses and a lot of problems.
Well, first, unemployment is not a significant problem right now. Okay, unemployment's about 4.2% last time I looked. GDP growth for the fourth quarter of 2024 was, I believe, 2.4%. What we're anxiously waiting for is what are the GDP numbers for the first quarter of 2025. Opinions vary widely with regard to, what those numbers will be. Real wages are going up because inflation is down significantly. In fact, the inflation declined a little bit in March as compared to February. Not that it's not an issue, but it's down significantly from what it has been. But I think the whole thing really comes down to two things. Number one, this trade situation. We need to get this resolved sooner rather than later. Nobody's a winner in a trade war. The uncertainty creates more volatility in the markets. It also reduces the willingness of business to invest because they're unsure how things are going to fall out. So I think resolving these trade issues as quickly as possible is important. And the second issue, and you're not going to be surprised that I say this, is we got to put our finances in order. And the fact of the matter is that the Senate bill that has passed the House, the budget framework as a way to get negotiations going for the budget reconciliation process is irresponsible and unacceptable. It makes things worse as compared to current law rather than better. And it's time that we recognize the reality that we're living beyond our means, and we need to start taking steps to be able to reduce our deficits and stabilize our debt to GDP at a reasonable, sustainable level. So, those are the two big issues. And, the Fed, you can complain about the Fed all you want, but the biggest problem is the Congress. The Congress has been totally irresponsible with regard to fiscal policy. The last time we passed all of our appropriations bills on time was 1996. They've only done it 4 times in my lifetime. That's an F minus. And by the way, that's the only express and enumerated responsibility in the Constitution for the Congress to do every year. And they've done it 4 times in 73 years.
Well, you I'm sure are views that Chuck Schumer's support of the of that bill that you referred to just a minute ago, much to the chagrin of Democrats, I'm sure. But I think just in relation to that China situation, look, it's a big economy, and one of the issues with that massive amount of debt that they're holding is, and I've been saying this for many years now, it's really unfair, I think, of the United States and other countries like Australia to be constantly purchasing Chinese-made goods, and they're not selling them anything. So all they get stuck with is our money, but they can't spend it. And so what they then do is they buy up our debt. But eventually, the roosters have to come home to roost, so to speak. So it is a problem. I think China does need to increase its trade routes around the world. And we are all Western countries are going to suffer if we don't get our debt under control. And the most notable one, of course, is the United States with that massive, massive debt to GDP level that it has, and the unfunded liabilities that we've talked about on previous shows.
Well, as you know, Shaquille, Japan's actually worse than us, but there's a difference. The Japanese save, and most of their debt is owned by their own citizens. The U.S. does not save to the extent we're big consumers. About 70% of our economy is based on consumption. And one of the things that also has to happen is that Chinese consumption needs to increase. That's another thing that needs to happen.
Yeah, but that's my point. The Chinese try to increase their consumption, but we won't sell them anything. Like, just take Australia, for example. We've been so hesitant to sell them anything, and then we complain when they say, well, look, we want your dairy products, so if you're not going to sell it to us, we'll use the money that we've got and buy farms in Australia. And then, of course, Australians say, well, look, the Chinese are buying everything. You can't have it both ways. So it is really important. Now, I do think it's worth noting that some of Trump's trade wars is about trying to balance those trade deficits and trying to make sure that, hey, if you're tariffing us and we're not tariffing you, that's not necessarily fair. Look, I understand that, but that's an argument perhaps you can have with countries like Australia. You can't really have that argument with countries like China because the US taxes completely differently to the way that China does. And in relation to Europe, the major issue with Europe not purchasing enough from China, from the United States, as I'm sure Nick will attest, is that a lot of US-made products don't conform to European safety standards, right? And the Europeans, just like the Australians, have been saying to America for years, I've been saying it for such a long period of time, we love American cars. Sell them to us. Can you just make a couple of changes? But the factories refuse to do it when it comes to food production. There's a heap of American foods which are really popular outside of the United States, but because they won't make some very small changes, it doesn't apply with health and safety standards in other countries. And so that's why, or that's part of the reason why there's a trade deficit that happens. And I think that's being ignored when it just comes to an issue about tariffs.
Well, let's talk just for a second about something that's been in the news lately, and that is automobiles, cars. Okay, you know, the European Union charges a higher tariff on U.S. automobile imports than we do of European imports. But you know, and you could say, okay, if you're going to charge us 10%, we're going to charge you 10%. That's not what's being proposed, by the way, but you know, you could say that. But let me tell you, if you look in my garage, I have 2 European and 1 Japanese car. I've owned American cars in the past, and I'll probably own them again in the future. But the truth is, I think that you know, some countries do better at producing certain things than others, and I think, you know, my personal view is the Germans and the Japanese do a better job with regard to producing cars. The Americans do the best job in producing trucks and SUVs. But then again, if you actually look at the streets in Japan, and if you look at the streets in many European cities, they're too big.
Too big.
Yeah, but then why aren't you selling those SUVs to countries like Australia? We're a big, expansive country. I mean, that's the point that I'm making. There's so many markets, and America just will not do simple things like we want amber flashing indicator lights instead of red flashing indicator lights. And America's like, oh, no, we're not going to do that. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me that America refuses to change its rules.
I hear you, and your point is well taken.
Hey, David, just really quickly along those same lines, and with the whole notion of cars, since we're on the topic of cars, a friend of mine gave me a lift because y'all know I get around by mass transit, and he noticed the price of gas had gone up and all along those lines. So is the tariff impacting those gas prices going up, and will we continue to see them going up? Because he did notice that as he was driving me those few miles to get from my job to my house and everything. But that was something he just happened to observe on several gas stations.
Well, I don't know about North Carolina, which is where you are, but they've actually come down somewhat in Virginia.
Toby, you had your hand up. That's good.
Well, actually, staying on the car thing, because Dave, I completely agree with you on the cars, because I love me some cars. And tech-wise, the American cars are built for muscle and strength, and that's what they've always been. And that's the calling card of the American car. Europeans, well, the Japanese cars and German cars. Well, German cars also have power because the Porsche, one of my favorite cars in the world. But in terms of the tech-wise, the Japanese and the Chinese cars have always actually led the way in that, because we've never actually put the tech in there. We've always put the engine in there. But speaking on that, that's why Tesla, when it first came out, or when they started really taking over the market globally, that's why people like the Tesla car, because not only was it small, but it also had some great tech in there. However, this is staying on that Tesla idea. China has their own car that is taking over the market, taking over globally, which is the BYD. That one is actually taken off. In terms of trucks, by the way, Rivian, which is an American car made out of California, that one actually is the best SUV style electric vehicle. But BYD, speaking on them, they have taken over the market globally from Tesla, and they have some amazing tech in there. BYD is barred from selling in the US. And my question to you, Dave, is because dealing with these tariff situations and the trade war with China, do you think, because BYD wants to come into the US market because they know they could take over that market, because their car is the actual BYD car is actually cheaper than the Tesla, but actually has a little bit better tech on the inside of it. And they've just created a minivan that is being released later this year, which is amazing. If you haven't checked it out, check out that BYD minivan. Phenomenal. Do you think the tariffs themselves, one, are protectionist to help Tesla in that light because they deal with the automobiles? Or do you think, do you think if we do resolve this trade war, could the BYD end up coming to the U.S. in an automobile trade-off?
Well, I think it's possible. The fact is that we have to make sure that we're credible. if we say that we want to eliminate non-tariff trade barriers, if we want reciprocity with regard to actual tariffs, that's a two-way street. We're very concerned because we don't have access to the Chinese market with regard to a number of things. We're very concerned that the Chinese are, steal IP regularly, if you will. At the same point in time, you're talking about EVs. China now produces 67% of all EVs, and so I think hopefully this thing will get resolved where we will have real reciprocity and real equity, and that means that some of the current players might not benefit from what that change is.
If I can just make a comment about tech, we have a well-known company here called Holden, which manufactures Australian-made vehicles. They don't anymore. General Motors bought them, and then to the dismay of Australians, they actually closed down the Holden. But what was really interesting was that the tech in the Holdens was fantastic. It was on par with the European cars that were coming in, BMWs, Mercedes, etc. One of my trips to the United States 6 or 7 years ago, I drove through in a Cadillac, which I personally felt was very similar in its tech and the way it drove to what I'd find in a BMW or a Mercedes. So I don't think it's something that the United States can't do, and I don't subscribe to the view that Germany is better at producing those things than the United States. I think the United States can do it, but it just needs a little bit of leadership, and I think perhaps a little bit of government pressure on some of the car manufacturers would be positive. But again, I think if the United States wants to fix its trade deficits, it has to produce things that the rest of the world wants. And the rest of the world actually tells America what they want. And so all America has to do is go, hey, you want this? Okay, we'll make it for you. Because the alternative is that those countries go elsewhere.
Well, I remember when I was younger, in my mid-30s, I was sent by the American Council of Young Political Leaders on several international trips, one of which was to Japan, where we met with the Prime Minister, a number of cabinet officials, the head of Toyota, the head of Seiko, the head of Keidan Ren, which is basically their Chamber of Commerce, if you will, several of their governors. But we also had an opportunity to spend the night in some Japanese homes. And it was very, very evident to me that given the size of their homes, given the width of their streets, that the Americans were totally out of touch with regard to what kind of products would be attractive to the Japanese. And it comes back, Shaquille, to what you said, right? You need to be sensitive to differences in different countries, and you need to be able to adapt your product and services to recognize those differences if you want to have any decent market share with regard to what your products are or what your services are.
David, what about the financial calculus that we're seeing that doesn't seem to me to add up? Number one, the U.S. Congress wants to decrease taxes, which means less revenue, which means a bigger deficit. Then number two, we have China come along and we slapped our creditor in the face, which normally you don't do. But let's assume that they decide they want to pull the debt. In other words, they're basically going to not purchase U.S. debt. Those combinations will drive up interest on the debt. When the interest rate is, and already interest on the debt's the number one budget item, now it becomes a super budget item. Doesn't that have the possibility of this financial calculus, which looks like we're heading, throwing the United States into a major recession by increasing the debt, increasing the deficit, because China decides to pull out, and all of a sudden your biggest banker just decided not to lend you any more money?
Well, remember what I said, the two biggest concerns that I have. The two biggest concerns I have is how do we resolve this tariff issue? And secondly, how do we resolve our fiscal challenge, which is what you're talking about. The largest line item in the federal government's budget is Social Security. The second largest line item is interest, and it's the fastest growing line item. And what do we get for interest? Nothing. So I am very concerned. The Congress, with regard to revenues, are talking about doing two things: extending all of the Trump tax cuts from 2017, and providing new tax cuts in connection with tips, overtime, and Social Security benefits. As you've heard me say many times, not all tax cuts stimulate the economy. Very few tax cuts pay for themselves. You combine that with the Senate's budget proposal, where they're committing to cut spending at least $5 billion over 10 years. Yes, you heard that right. $5 billion over 10 years. That's chump change, okay? But even the House bill, which wants to do 1.5 trillion over 10 years, well, divide that by 10, that's 150 billion a year, and we're running a deficit of 2 trillion a year. So that's nothing to smile about either. These people need to get serious. And you've heard me say before, what we need a fiscal sustainability commission where everything's on the table, but not everything's equal. By that, I mean mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and revenues, okay? And we need a constitutional amendment that will limit how much debt as a percentage of the economy we can take on, which will force elected officials to make tough choices on a recurring basis and cease mortgaging the future of our country, our children, grandchildren, and future generations. And I'm fighting and continue to fight for that and more.
But you know that if there was a constitutional amendment, as you've proposed, that Congress, whether it be controlled by Republicans or Democrats, are going to hit that max and then stay there forever. There's no doubt about that. But you're right; it would probably stop them from increasing the amount they're spending. And America certainly does need to get its spending under control and get its deficits under control, because it's it is really, really problematic, and it's destabilizing to all of the other countries, which are the natural allies of the United States. Sort of make a very quick point. A handful of minutes ago, President Trump announced that all the flags will be at half-mast today because of the passing of the Pope. So don't know if you guys are aware of that or not.
Yeah, I'm Roman Catholic, a practicing Roman Catholic, and
Yeah, well, my condolences to you for the loss of the Pope. I said that on the previous show as well to our Catholic friends.
Yeah, thank you. Well, may he rest in peace with God. I'm also president of my neighborhood, among other things, and we lowered our flag, our neighborhood flag, to half staff as well. So, yeah.
I'm lighting a candle today in memory of him. Francis was great. He fought for human rights and humanity. I think he was very powerful in institutionalizing human rights that didn't exist before. He had a big, passionate and compassionate heart. I just think everything that he established for humanity, I pray that it holds. And, he was very upset with what was going on with America and not happy with the way things were being, people were being treated. So I pray that he is having a good conversation with God right now, and I'm sure he is.
He was controversial in the church, and
yes, he was.
You're correct. You're correct to say it'll be interesting to see who the next pope is, and whether or not they're going to be a progressive, which many would argue Francis was, or whether they're going to be more conservative, which Benedict was. Personally, my favorite pope has been and remains John Paul II.
Everybody loved John Paul. He seemed to be able to handle controversial issues very well. I don't know how he managed that so well, but as we know, it's not just who they pick, but it's also about the smoke, right? So, I was born Catholic, and raised Catholic. So
I converted from being a Methodist to being a Roman Catholic when John Paul II was Pope, and I wear, and I do not take it off, a cross that he blessed in an audience that I was fortunate to have with him.
Wow!
Yeah,
Hey,
we're wanting
David,
a private audience. Okay,
I-
well,
I-
hey, David, just along those
I
lines.
had a
maybe-
similar experience with
Yeah.
when one of the bishops was canonized in San Francisco, and I still have the little gift he gave me when that happened. So I get goosebumps thinking about it. Yeah.
Hey, David, just along those lines and everything, just really quickly, because I'm not Catholic, but I did go to a Jesuit university and have friends that are big believers in liberation theology, which is definitely one of the more progressive versions of Catholicism and just religion in general. But I'm just curious, and I know it's getting away from economics. Do you think that there will be a push to have somebody from a particular region? Because I've heard people speculating about Asia and Africa as being where the next pope may come from. But I just wanted your take on that as a practicing Catholic.
well, as you know, Francis was the first Jesuit
Yes.
pope. Okay,
Yes.
he was also the first pope from the Western Hemisphere.
Yes.
He was also the first pope from Latin America, and I think. But something I found out that I didn't know about Pope Francis is his parents were Italian immigrants to Argentina,
Well,
which means that he did have Italian roots,
Mhm.
which obviously helped him because most popes up until recent years have been Italian, and I think there is a desire to try to provide more geographic diversity. The church is growing in Asia. The church is growing in Africa. The church is growing somewhat in South America, and so I think that's something I'm sure that will be on people's minds. But we'll just have to wait and see.
There was a
Want
report that
to add
came out in
something about
Australia
the
a few days
financial
ago.
impact is Catholic Church is probably one of the largest, and we know this, churches, but they get the most money in the world. And they've turned it around and they invest in startups in a faith foundation program. And probably they invest the most, many, many millions of dollars goes back into startup programs that benefit society, right? So, keep an eye on that as well. But they are very economically sound. I think they try to make the communities, the world, the country economically sound. I think, we don't give them enough credit for doing that. And, it is going to be interesting to see who they put in place of Francis. So.
There was a report that came out a few days ago here in Australia that across all denominations, there's actually been an uptick in church attendance. And most interestingly there was a significant increase across the Western world in church attendance by young people, as in the Gen Zs and the younger millennials. So I found that quite interesting. I think the church went through a somewhat benighted time about a decade or so ago, but I think its reputation is beginning to come back, and I think people are looking for that, for that connection to God and some structure to their lives. So I hope that they pick a good pope that will be a great leader.
Shaquille, to that point and everything along those lines, it is the plug for one of our other shows, Dropping Pearls with Mama G, which is one of our newer shows, and she is of a religious background. That's actually what the topic was, because she has Thomas, who is a fellow minister. So they're both ministers in the church and everything. I think one is more independent than the other in terms of church affiliations. But that's actually something today we're talking about was what you just said, Shaquille, which is that church membership is going up instead of going down. So it is definitely a sign that more people are wanting to turn back to faith and all along those lines. So that's something that they talked about yesterday on her show, which airs Sundays on the network at 7:00.
And I've heard the same thing. And as you all know, I'm an usher, a lead usher at my Catholic parish, and my wife sings in the choir. And of course, yesterday was the holiest day of the year for Catholics, Easter Sunday. And of course, you're going to have overwhelming attendance on Easter Sunday. We have some people who we call CEOs, Christmas and Easter only.
Yeah.
The number one religion in the United States is Roman Catholic. The number 2 religion in the United States is former Roman Catholic.
In fact, I have friends now, and they say those are the only 2 days they really don't want to go to church anymore because it's so crowded. They can't get to the parking lot because it's just too crowded. So I had a few friends over yesterday, and they kind of skipped church because, on that morning, they go all the other times. So
It can get too crowded, that's for sure. And there's David knows everybody will come out in their, for lack of a better term, Easter fineries on that particular day. So you will see some folks that might not have the best dresses on any other day, but on Easter Sunday they come out in some of their Easter best outfits.
and hats.
I since we're doing plugs, Mark, I'll do a plug for the Lawyers Den tomorrow at 6 o'clock. We're having the lead attorney who filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration for declaring, basically he's saying that the tariffs are illegal and the tariffs should be manufactured by Congress. It's a legislative, not an executive function. Since he filed the suit in the U.S. Court of International Trade, another lawsuit was filed in California by our friend Gavin Newsom using the same legal theory, and another one in Florida has been filed. So there are 3 suits. It's a very interesting constitutional issue that Congress is the one that needs to take leadership in tariffs, not the executive branch.
We'll see how Pam Bondi responds to that Florida.
I don't know. We're actually, the lead attorney is with the Liberation Group in Washington, D.C. He's going to be on our show tomorrow night at 6 o'clock to explain the legal theory behind Trump doesn't have the power to impose any tariffs.
Correct me if I'm wrong, didn't Lindsey Graham in an interview say something like that he shouldn't technically have done it, but Congress won't do anything about it because it's all controlled by the Republicans? Didn't Lindsey Graham say something on those lines recently?
I don't know. I'd like to hear David's point on it, but we're going to have the attorney who drafted the suit in tomorrow at 6 o'clock.
Let me jump in on that, okay?
Sure.
Because one of the persons who's a friend of mine from Mass is a long-standing Senate staffer, very senior Senate staffer. And while under the Constitution, the Congress is the lead with regard to tariff matters, the Congress has passed 3 pieces of legislation over many years that delegate certain authority to the president with regard to tariffs. And so the real question is what the president doing consistent with the scope of authority provided by those 3 pieces of legislation? If they are, then he's okay. If they're not, then he's not. And as you know, he tries to stretch the envelope. I mean, he's done several things, that he's tried to do via executive order, like birthright citizenship, which he clearly can't do through executive order. Okay, and so we'll see. But it's not as clear as some people would assert it. It's all a matter of whether or not it's within the scope of the authorities that have been delegated to the president, including whether or not this is deemed to be an emergency.
Yeah. Well, I can send an invite for the panel discussion tomorrow, David, at 6 o'clock. It's got to be an interesting case. I read through the complaint. They haven't filed an answer yet, and I'm just looking at how you can defend it is going to be very interesting. And of course, on May the 5th, we do have the Supreme Court who's going to have the hearing relating to birthright citizenship. So unfortunately, the Supreme Court is closed. You can't just go in and talk to these people. It doesn't work that way. But I might get a interview with one of the attorneys that are handling the case on that particular issue. With that, our case is over with because we're at the hour. We wanted to thank the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, our viewers in the United States, and of course, around the world. And we'll see you next week on Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.